Well, thanks again for the privilege of being together to look at some of these important questions. Tonight, it's question number 8. And the question is it sometimes better to just pass over the problems that come up between husband and wife rather than trying to work them out? So that's a tricky question. And the answer is yes and no. I'm going to read a couple of verses in Ephesians chapter 4. I probably have mentioned this before, but I have found over the years that Ephesians chapter 4 is tremendously useful for marital counseling because there's basically a perfect parallel between the marriage relationship and the relationship between believers in the body of Christ. There's a oneness. There are principles that belong in this close relationship that are very, very much parallel. And so in verse 1 and 2, it says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called, with all lowliness and meekness, with long suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So you have this attitude of forbearance and long suffering, which would seem to imply putting up with things that you can't necessarily resolve or get rid of. That's something that's an ongoing issue. Now, in verse 15, he says, but speaking the truth in love may grow up into him in all things, who is the head, even Christ. And it speaks about the body growing and developing, making increase of the body to the edifying of itself in love. And then from verse 25 down, there's quite a list of challenges, of a challenge of change from certain kinds of behavior to better behavior. So in verse 25, it says, wherefore putting away lying, speak everyone truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. So I'm just going to use some of the principles that are found in these verses as a foundation. We're not going to spend time really developing the verses so much as just using the basic principle. And so I will say, first of all, the idea of avoiding excuse me, passing over the problem, it's not a good default strategy. And what I mean by that is the strategy that you adopt as your default response. When a problem comes up, avoidance is just basically pretending it didn't happen. Not responding, not reacting, or very minimally. And then as soon as it's possible, you just carry on and you don't go back and discuss it later. You just pretend it didn't really happen and you continue on as usual. Now that alleviates the immediate stress, but it does not resolve the issue, nor does it strengthen the relationship bond between you. And I remember reading some articles relating to conflict. And there's one statement mentioned that avoidance is actually one of the critical risk factors leading to divorce. Because the more that you avoid trouble spots, trouble areas, there becomes more and more areas of life that become no-fly zones, where you don't go there, where you don't respond or react there. And avoidance can lead, and almost does lead to withdrawal from each other. You withdraw from each other's confidence. You withdraw from each other's communication. You don't talk about that problem, that aspect. You don't, and it even leads to avoiding each other, to avoid the conflict. And so that hinders what we see here in Ephesians chapter 4, where the stress is upon growth, development, and the relationship deepening and us being built up together in love. And so love and truth, as Ephesians 4 emphasizes, love and truth are the foundations of long-term relationships. Without love, it'll never survive. Without honesty, it will never survive, or at least it will be very much crippled. And so these principles are extremely important to hold in balance. So I'm just going to give a few comments about short-term and long-term on this issue. So we could say in the short term, yes, there are times when it's better just to avoid it or pass over it, not pick on it and confront it directly under certain conditions or situations. Number one, if you're too emotional at the moment to think through the issue reasonably. And that does happen. It certainly does happen. And the trouble is when we're angry, we tend to provoke one another. And then we start retaliating, and that it can become the opposite kind of a risk to the relationship, not of avoidance, but of escalation, where you escalate an issue until it becomes like a capital crime. And it was really not that big of a thing initially. And so you could be too emotional at the moment. Another one is that resolving the issue may simply not be worth the risk to the relationship. So we need to convey to each other this commitment that you are more important to me than the irritation that I feel. If we let ourselves completely disregard care for the other one because we're ticked about something, we're really saying to the other person, you don't matter to me as much as my feelings or this detail of life. And so we need to think that through carefully. And then the third one, I'm just going to give you, before I get to the third one, I remember just before I got married, my next older brother, David, and David got married, I think 2 years before me, I think so, yes. And in his infinite wisdom, being married for 2 years, he said, you will learn that there are some things that are just not worth squabbling over. So that's what he had learned in the first 2 years, which is a pretty good thing to learn. There's some things not worth squabbling over. So we had the opportunity to visit with them just this summer. And of course, they're in Chile and we're in Canada. And so we hardly ever have time together. And it was really refreshing. And it was kind of so neat to see their interactions and just how funny they could be with each other, how much they could get along. And so the third condition or situation is that one of the partners is just simply not ready or willing to open up and to discuss it. And so I would suggest in that kind of situation, instead of taking it as a rejection immediately, just be patient and wait for some time when things are more normal and things seem to be fine with you. And just at a suitable time, very gently inquire why they don't want to talk about it, and express a desire to understand the other one's thoughts and feelings about whatever the situation is. However, long-term, as I've tried to emphasize from Ephesians 4, it is extremely important. It is essential for us to be honest with each other so that we learn what things actually do trouble the other. Or not even just what things, but what people. We all have sensitivities to other people who we may, for whatever reason, feel threatened by, or that they are a threat to our relationship. And so I would suggest, especially anything relating to other people or situations that trigger insecurity or trigger jealousy. We cannot afford to ignore that in our partner. We must be loyal to each other. we must put each other first. And it would be far better to avoid other friendships or restrict other friendships that seem threatening to our partner. So that's my general answer. But from, again, back to the first verse that I read in Ephesians 4, forbearing one another in love, there are personal weaknesses. There are even habits which we may battle all our lives. And living in long-term relationships requires long suffering, a willingness in our love, our commitment to our partner to endure things that might offend us or even hurt us if we can't resolve them adequately, or forbearing. Now, just earlier this evening, as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of the Old Testament, 2 Samuel 14. Remember when King David was longing for his son Absalom? There had been this terrible disruption in the family, terrible blot, a complication of consequences that happened after David's sin. And then his own son that, molested his own sister, half-sister. And then Absalom had taken vengeance for her and slew his own half-brother. What a disaster in a family. And David, Absalom is gone. He's in exile. And Joab sent this woman, we call her the wise woman of Tekoa. And here's the quote. She says, "For we must needs die. And we're like water spilt upon the ground that cannot be gathered up again. Neither does God respect any person. Yet does he devise means so that his banished be not expelled from him." There's some powerful wisdom and understanding of God and of life. And at times we see extremely sad things happening in families. And we think, I would never put up with that. It would be better for them to be separated, or it'd be better for them to kick that child out of the house. How can they? It's a disaster. And yet there are these things that seem to be in tension. God is holy, God is righteous, and he has very righteous and holy standards. And yet God has this compassion and love that will seek some means to overcome what seems like an impossible barrier in order to reconcile. And so that's to me a powerful verse that sometimes we can't do anything else but cling to the God that we have come to know, and to be strengthened to endure through things that affect us.